Hello, I'm Wiltus. Today I just did a quick training session, although I'm not going to get into that right now. Before that, I want to talk about some videos that might be coming up, may or may not. But generally speaking, uh, I am going to eventually be making a video addressing issues of nationalism. Now, before that, I want to put out some intellectual framework for that. So I've already done my video on normative ethics, and I'm also going to address populism before nationalism because I think it's very relevant to the idea of nationalism as well as popular sovereignty. I want to address both of those in the same video. And although I have thought out many of these things, I have not yet reached the entelechy that I require to feel confident making a video about that. So that's some announcements for the future. But anyway, today I wanted to say that, as some of you may know, I am eventually going to go sword fighting against John from Generational Gap, and for that, I decided to do a little bit of training. Now, of course, I don't actually have the type of sword or even the type of practice sword that would be used in HEMA. So instead, I decided to train with a weapon that in some ways prepares me for that type of fight. And I decided, why not train with something that I could use that would make me, in essence, perhaps overtrain in some ways, so that I can maybe have somewhat of an advantage. So, although I do have a kendo sword, I didn't use that. I instead decided to use a sledgehammer. And with a sledgehammer, I decided that why not make this a martial art in itself? Because just like politically speaking, instead of expressing my political views in the terms of existing political parties and existing ideologies and existing philosophical concepts, I just make my own because, I don't know, maybe I like thinking outside of the box. So I decided to do a bit the same thing with this martial art. So I decided to make a martial art that focuses on using really heavy weapons. So I was thinking about a name for what I could call this. Now, I practice Taekwondo, which is a Korean martial art, but because I'm not Korean, it didn't make sense to name a new martial art using a Korean naming scheme. So, and since I'm going to be sword fighting coming up, and HEMA, a lot of HEMA is based on the German school of fencing. There's also the Italian one and others as well, but that's the most prolific one. I decided to instead take my my birth tongue, my first language, German, and name it in German. So I decided on the name Schwerwaffendrehungkampfkunst, which loosely translates heavy weapon rotation martial art. Or you could say heavy weapon rotation, or heavy rotation if you want to be a meme lord. And it sort of emphasizes the particular elements that I'm going after. So, of course, it's a martial art, and it uses heavy weapons. So in this case, a sledgehammer. However, theoretically, it could be used similarly with other heavy things, such as a big lumber axe or something, or maybe even a caber or something, a big log or something. And anything that's long and heavy, really. So in theory, you could make a long and heavy sword, and it would work under this system that I am making. So I went outside today, and I decided to really get the fundamentals down of this martial art. So I took my sledgehammer and I started swinging around. And I wasn't exactly sure what I was going for. I was really trying to get a feel for it, trying to really examine the best way to grip it. So what's interesting with the sledgehammer is, obviously, it's got a heavy head. So the point of balance on a sledgehammer is either at the head or almost at the head, very far up, which means it's very far from the end of the grip. Now, this of course puts the question: since you have a grip this long, how should you grip it? Now, I decided originally I started with a grip similar to one that you would use with long swords, where you have both hands towards one end. At one point, I thought that because of the difficulty I had getting leverage, that it might be better to use one hand in the middle. But that's when something became very obvious, and that is that if you have one of your hands towards the middle, not only is the range of your attack reduced, but also the range of motion is reduced, which means that if you want to get a full rotation, you can't really do that while gripping the middle of the weapon, because you can't really swing it down all the way, which is something that's important for getting the rotation, especially on the downstroke, which was really the technique that I was practicing today. Really going from the top and going down. And I really got into the exactness of the technique and how the footwork should go. And obviously an advantage is stepping forward with the same foot that the side of the attack is. And that allows also for the hammer to pass in front of you when it's coming down for the rotation. And the advantage of that, of having the hammer in front of you rather than behind you, might not be obvious to everyone. But first of all, from a self-defense perspective, if the hammer is behind you, it's kind of hard to use. Although if the hammer is behind you, there's not a lot of potential for it injuring you. There is the problem that you can't really change the grip very well if it's behind you. One thing I also noticed, an important principle, is that the martial art needs to be ambidextrous. And the reason it has to be is because it's not possible, at least from my perspective, to get the necessary, I guess, not necessarily strength, but the right type of strength. In other words, it's not very smooth to attack the same way from the left as it is with the right without switching your hands, especially if you have a very heavy weapon. And that's very problematic if you're trying to get a good swing of things, a good momentum, which is what you need for this martial art to work. Because if you are constantly moving, if you have a constant motion going with the hammer, it's less of a strain than simply swinging and stopping and then having to lift the hammer again. And this is one of the advantages of this martial art. Now, of course, this martial art is, of course, not entirely unbased, in the sense that it's not that this is something I just came up with today. This is a concept that I had developed quite a bit ago. So this type of martial art, of course, involves a lot of rotating motions, which is not something that is common in Taekwondo, which is more rectilinear in its motions. Now, of course, people will dispute that, but I'm just speaking generally here, because I know there are rotating motions in Taekwondo, because I am very experienced in it. I've got over a decade of experience. But anyway, when you've got the heavy weapon martial art is what I developed out of a fictional martial art that I had conceptually developed for my stories, where it's I think the exact name is Od Grozelan. It's named after the fictional founder, but that's not very important. But the point is that it is something that I thought about significantly before actually trying to put it into practice today. So I already had conceptually noted several important principles in it, and also several problems that need to be addressed. So, for example, the problem with this martial art is that it certainly is not one that anyone should simply pick up on their own. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you're not experienced with martial arts, in the sense that you don't have expertise in it, or you're not being supervised by someone who has expertise, you should not try this at home, because you could very potentially break your back, smash your own bones, pull your joints out of socket, tear ligaments. Because if you mess up on the movement, you could very much overstrain your body, which is a significant problem that is going to make this martial art very difficult for a lot of people to get into, and also means that there's a potential that certain people will get injured to a degree that they will not be able to continue. And I, of course, having experience, was aware of these potential issues and address it. Now, all martial arts have certain ways that they stress the physical body, and this one stresses it by putting a large amount of weight pulling away from the body at all times, which is, of course, very difficult, especially if you try to move your back as freely as you would with certain other martial arts, which is something you should not do in this one, because if you try doing that, you can very much injure yourself very significantly, because of the weight of the weapon that you're using. So that's always very important. So of course, I think I got the technique for the downstroke down pretty well. So I got to the point where I was doing a 2 steps forward, 2 steps back technique test, where I swing with one side and I step forward, I swing with the other side and I step forward, and then I do the same but stepping back, both of which work. So that's as far as the well-developed techniques are. I also have to work on the upstroke and on side swinging strokes, which are going to be a bit more difficult when it concerns rotation. I also have to think about the footwork in a more exact way, since the footwork is extremely important for martial arts, especially if you're thinking about historical theories concerning sword fighting. Footwork is always very important. And another thing is the incorporation of other techniques, such as grappling, punching, and kicking, is also going to be important, especially with a martial arts like this, where the disadvantage that this martial arts has, even though, okay, let me get into the huge advantage before I get into the disadvantage. The huge advantage is that you're swinging a heavy weapon at a high speed and hitting very frequently, which means that you're very likely, let's say you're attacking an unarmored opponent, if you get a clean hit in, that person's down, okay? There's nothing they can do about it. If you get a clean hit, that person's down. So that's one advantage. And also, even if they're not down, if they block it somehow, it's still gonna be a pain to block. So it's gonna take all their strength to block it. And that's another advantage. Now, the disadvantage is that the rotation that is required in order to bring the technique to its fruition is one that is theoretically predictable. This means that your opponents will have the ability to guess where you're going to go next simply by analyzing the geometry of a martial art and the ergonomics that you require to do it. Now, of course, you could theoretically break the ergonomics of a martial art, which may very well break your body as well. So that means that in between hits, you always have a vulnerability, because your opponents know that you will not be able to hit in a certain way immediately following a hit based on how the hit went, which means that you need to be able to use the rest of your body to compensate for that weakness. So that's another important thing. So tell me what you think. Do you think I'm going overboard with developing a martial art entirely for the purpose of training in order to have a sword fight? Or I obviously am not going to use the same techniques in the sword fight because that would be kind of silly and would look really weird, and probably actually it might be a big surprise. But I think the advantage is that it's really giving me some upper body training, which is something I've never really been very good at. Even though I've got kicks that can fell trees, my upper body isn't as strong. So swinging a sledgehammer around willy-nilly is really helping me with that. Additionally, I will say that. So tell me what you think. Essentially, and ideally, by the time the fight goes around, I may have the confidence to call myself a grandmaster when it concerns Schwerwaffendrehungkampfkunst, at least. Since I'm the only practitioner, I will automatically be the grandmaster. But I don't feel confident calling myself that until I have as I said, an enteleki, a fullness, a completeness of what it is, so that I fully actualized it from its potential, which is currently where I'm standing, and hopefully that happens. So anyway, tell me what you think. Shout out to Robert from Generational Gap. Always a kind man, very nice. I like Robert a lot. I don't know why. He's just a good guy. So anyway, thank you all for watching, and I'll be seeing you all next time. Adultus over and out.